Things I'll talk a little bit about my personal experience and maybe touch a little bit on some research of mine, so you can get a sense of what it means to be pursuing a PhD in economics and what kind of research you kind of do in that direction. And then I've got kind of some general advice for Kolbe mules, and then we'll save some time at the end for some Q&A. Let me see if I can get this screen. At least that's okay. Okay, so to give you a little bit of a background on kind of who I am, just so that you have some context, I'm a Kolbe alumnus. I graduated in 2013. At Kolbe, I was an economics and mathematics major, or the dash major, where you kind of do basically all of the economics major and 3/4 of the math major. I worked at two different feds. So in college, I worked at the Boston Fed for a summer as an intern, and then after Kolbe, I worked at the San Francisco Fed for a bit. And then since then, I've been a PhD student in the econ department at UC Berkeley. And I'm an applied microeconomist, which means I'm looking at questions related to the decisions and sort of behavior and actions that individuals make as opposed to the macroeconomy. And that kind of touches on a range of subjects, but includes things like labor, market decisions, public finance questions like taxation, and then even some things that maybe don't fall neatly into a particular field, but are still sort of micro questions at their core. And then I'm also a behavioral economist, which basically means that I use a lot of psychology in my work and understand how like biases affect people in the way that they go about their economic decision making. So I should say, if you guys have questions sort of in the middle of what I'm saying, you should definitely feel free to interrupt. It seems like we have, like a nice sized group. It looks like we've got about 15 to 20 of you guys. So it's not like we're going to be holding everybody up. If somebody, has a burning question, we might as well sort of stop along the way, and maybe Adam can keep track. If there's like somebody raising their hand and I don't see it, you can let me know. But I'm also a two-time Kolbe intramural broomball champion, which is probably the thing I miss most about Kolbe, many-time runner-up. Okay, so as far as career options go, the way that I kind of think about this is there's basically private sector opportunities, and there's public policy roles and kind of government roles, and then potentially feeding into one of those two tracks is also kind of the decision whether or not to go to graduate school. So before kind of getting into those different paths, I think it's useful to think about some misconceptions about economics. And maybe I'm not sure if this is applicable to anybody on this call, but if there are people here that are, in their freshman or sophomore year, and you're not, 100% sure if you really want to do economics or not, or even if you're a little bit later and you still just don't know, how much you like economics, I think it's useful to think about what the different misconceptions about economics are. So I think the first misconception is that economics equals the stock market. There's lots of questions that economists work on that have nothing to do with that, which could involve things like health outcomes, like how do we increase trust in vaccines, or how do we, it could be an education question, how do we make effective grading policies for getting people to learn the most, or there's lots of interesting development questions as to like what makes effective policies for microfinance in developing countries. And I'm sure that some of you are aware of these different possibilities, but especially early on, it might seem like a lot of economics is kind of this narrow field related to asset pricing. That's really just a very small piece of it. Similarly, along those lines, I think another misconception is that economics is capitalism, and kind of there's this view that people think that all economists just think that taxes are creating deadweight loss, and actually a lot of economics is showing that taxes are necessary in certain circumstances, or that inequality is bad for particular reasons that we can measure in economic ways, like using happiness surveys, or things like suicide outcomes is something else that economists are looking at to infer how well off people are doing in sort of tangible ways, not kind of this like utility thing that we make up as if it exists. Okay, the next thing, which I think, the next two misconceptions which I think kind of go together are that economics is cool in theory, but doesn't work that well in practice, or somehow simultaneously it oversimplifies the world, but it's also too complicated. And I think a lot of this has to do with a couple things. So a lot of the rules that we talk about in economics are this kind of the laws that we, or the relationships that we identify in economics. You know, it's easy to find an exception to the rule, but a lot of them work very well a lot of the time, and they still teach you something. The other thing that I'll mention about kind of economics simplifying the world or making it too complicated is I think some people come into economic modeling with like a weird notion of economic modeling in the sense that all models are wrong. It's just a question of, is it insightful? So we might have a model of some behavior and it's clearly going to be wrong in some ways, but it might tell us something interesting about the world. And that's basically what economics is trying to do in some sense. And, you know, how complicated or realistic you make a model is going to inform, is going to be driven by what's the goal of the model. So if you're trying to make a sort of simple statement to understand the world in sort of these broad terms, then you're going to have a simpler model. And if you're trying to predict very precisely about like what sorts of things affect the stock price of a particular stock, then you might have a very complicated model. And so you always want to ask yourself, you know, what's the goal of this model? And then how does that inform how I evaluate how useful it is? Okay, another misconception I think is that economists don't agree on anything. And I think I'll say two things about this. One is that in some sense, this is true in that, you know, different people will have different opinions. And I think that stems from two places. One is it's either politically motivated, in which case a lot of those people aren't, you know, actually thinking through the economics of it, but just kind of their ideology. But the second thing is that actually this could be a feature rather than a bug of economics where, and I say that because I think economics can be, you know, a framework to understand how to approach a problem. And then what you put into your analysis is going to inform what you get out of it. And kind of the fun part about it is determining what's important to put into the analysis. And maybe you can come up with, you know, a better way to look at something informed by kind of the way that economics teaches you to think about a problem that you may have at hand. The last thing that I would say is a misconception about economics is that, you know, some people, I think recently there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, who fits into the world of economics. And the thing that I'll say about this is that oftentimes the people that have kind of the most interesting perspectives are precisely the people that, you know, maybe historically haven't fit into economics for whatever reason, because they're more familiar or come at a question from a different angle. So I don't think that's a reason to not get into economics. Okay. I think that when it comes to thinking about different career options, an important question to ask yourself is, what type of economics nerd are you? And I think economics attracts a certain type of person, but it also is going to help you build a lot of skills. And at least the way that I started to think about this was, you know, there's people that like to really think about how do people make decisions and why do they make the decisions that they do. And that's kind of like the person that I am personally. You could also be, you know, the type of person that wants to understand how to make the world a better place and something like that. Or you could be really into problem solving or coming up with strategies to you know, get really good at something, whatever that thing may be. You also might just be, you know, really into data, or a communicator. And I think what goes hand in hand with this question is, you know, when thinking about future careers that you might want to set yourself up for now, I think it is important to sort of step back and think about what you care about. You know, is it helping people? Is it understanding the world? Do you want to have a comfortable lifestyle? It's a perfectly valid reason. You know, do you like working with others? I think is a really important question because, you know, a lot of data analysis work can involve a lot of work that you're working by yourself a lot. And so, evaluating which careers you're going to be happy in requires thinking about these questions. So with all that said, the way that I kind of think about the private sector opportunities available to econ majors is basically as follows. Kind of the big three in my mind are like, there's a lot of tech companies that are hiring people that have economics skills recently. So often these are like data science roles. And oftentimes what you're doing in these, at these companies is working on pricing. So something that's changed a lot in the last, 10 to 15 years as, more and more information is digitized and so forth, is that companies have been able to price discriminate on an individual level in a way that they've never been able to do until the 21st century. And so what that means for companies is that they need a lot of people that understand the economics of, how do I charge this person exactly what they're willing to pay? And that might be different from this person. And how do we separate those people based on what we know about them? And those can lead to interesting questions. Some of the other things that you'd work on those sorts of jobs is testing like the effectiveness of different advertisements. What types of advertisements get people to click on things, and all these companies want a lot of engagement. So it's figuring out what features make people engaged, and that can work both on the ad side, but just on the core product side. Like you think about Instagram adding different features to Instagram. They do a lot of testing to figure out what people like, and so that's kind of what I think you do in a lot of those roles. And so it's a lot of, I would say it's a lot of coding work, but you're definitely working on some tangible problems. The second kind of big private sector role is consulting, and there's many different types of consulting, but probably the two that make the most sense for econ majors are management consulting and economic consulting. So in management consulting, basically you're hired to kind of give an outside perspective on how a firm is running. So you might be saying, basically evaluating, who's adding value, who is not adding value, how can you make people more productive. That could take the form of, identifying, are you having too many meetings? Are you not having enough meetings? Are you giving people enough paid time off to recover? Do you have like the right company culture? And you might be testing different like culture messages and so forth. Are people like writing in the chat? And I'm not sure I'm seeing these if there are questions, but I keep hearing some things.
I don't see anything right now.
Okay.
But I'll let you know.
Okay, no problem. Just I want to make sure I wasn't missing anything. And then, so the second type of consulting that makes sense for econ majors is economic consulting, and here the work is a little bit different. Basically, in these types of jobs, often what you're doing is you're being hired by a team of lawyers who have an economic question. So, for example, you might be hired to, let's say that there was some drug that was out on the market, and it turns out that there were some negative side effects. And so people that were taking that drug were negatively affected. And because of that, there's going to be a class action lawsuit where people are going to be have the right to some money if they had taken that drug. And basically what you might be hired to do is to come up with the economic value of the negative consequences associated with taking that drug without having those been known to the consumer beforehand. So that's kind of the consulting arm of things. The other big direction you might go is obviously in finance, and there's traditional banking roles where you're working on securing credit for companies through bonds or loans. You might be assessing the credit worthiness of either individuals or companies based on factors that we know about them. Like if it's people, then it's their credit score and things like that. If it's a company, it's how profitable are they and how profitable do you expect them to be and things like that. And then also asset management, where you're, basically coming up with portfolio strategies, or you're helping people with their portfolios of money and having them make smart decisions about that. And you could do that either for individuals or for nonprofits, like colleges have big endowments that they need to manage. Or the other big thing that uses a lot of skills is that econ majors have is being an actuary for an insurance company, where you're assessing the risk of different people and coming up with, what's the right price for, let's say, somebody's car insurance or something like that. There's also some startups that kind of bridge the gap between finance and tech, like Robinhood comes to mind, where those sorts of roles will be pretty data science heavy, but still involve some finance. Now, I also wanted to touch on a few different opportunities that, I think personally make a lot of sense for econ majors, but might not be the things that immediately come to your mind when you think of what you might want to do post-graduation. And those are what I've listed here in other opportunities, which is law school. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a second when I talk about graduate school, but I think that actually law uses a lot of the same skills as economics. Something that I think is going to be, it has become a pretty big industry is journalism, and specifically data journalism. So in the last, 10 years, there's been a big interest in using data in long form and short form journalism, and people that can really make compelling graphs that tell a story in a graph can, that's a pretty viable career. If I'm thinking of websites like 538 and the New York Times that have like really compelling data editors that can make interactive graphs that people can mess around with and play with different levers to see, if I implement Bernie Sanders tax policy, how is that going to affect different people and so forth. And so people that sort of like visualizing things, but also like the data aspect, might be interested in that. And if you like writing, then you can combine sort of data visualization with journalism as well. Another thing that you might not know about or have previously considered is what's known as operations management, where basically you are figuring out how to make your company efficient. So in a lot of ways, this looks like writing down an economic model of, what teams work well together and how do you increase the marginal product of people with these different factors of production, and actually writing down those models and like simulating different outcomes looks a lot like the econ that you might do in classes sometimes. Another kind of weird one that I came up with, which is probably a pretty niche market, but especially for people that really like thinking about strategies, is designing games. What makes a compelling game is like understanding incentives and playing with probabilities and people's risk assessment. Those are all things that you as econ majors have like particular experience with thinking about. Okay, so that's kind of the private sector options that I see out there. As far as public sector options, there's lots of different public policy, basically think tanks, and I've written down some here that you might, might be worth thinking about, like Mathematica if you're interested in health, or if you're interested in development, the World Bank is a good place to go. There's also a lot of government agencies that provide a track for working on economic questions, like obviously the feds or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or the census all have people working in economic roles. I think the bottom line for each of these is that basically being able to work with data is going to give you such a leg up in the job market. And working in economics helps you model behavior, which is going to inform how you understand data and make patterns out of data, and it also helps you, form logical arguments on the basis of data. And so I think kind of one theme of today is that, and you'll see this pop up later, is that I think being comfortable with data is a really good thing to acquire while you're at Colby. Okay, so let's see what we are here. All right, so as far as thinking about graduate school, different what you end up doing, what direction you end up doing is going to inform, what graduate school you end up going if you decide that you're interested in graduate school. And so, I think the 4 paths that make a lot of sense to me for econ graduates are the following. So MBAs make a lot of sense for people that want to have a kind of traditional private sector role, meaning those people working in finance and so forth. I will say that a lot of the value of those programs is in the professional networks that you develop there. And so, and they're also expensive. And for that reason, it's probably most worth it, or maybe only worth it if you go to a top program. I will say that a lot of companies will pay for you to get your MBA. So as you're looking for jobs, it's good to look out for places that have a history of paying for people to get their MBA, because if you're paying for it yourself, it can be pretty expensive. Okay, so the second option is law school. And like I was saying before, I think that law uses a lot of the same skills that economics does as far as thinking about things analytically and coming up with logical arguments, and especially counterfactual analysis. What would have happened if this wasn't the case? And there's lots of different areas of law which kind of allows you to work on what you are interested in. So, we're all probably familiar with the law that makes it to TV, where it's, criminal cases, but the vast majority of law is actually on the civil side, where you're working on tax questions, labor contracts and disputes, or things related to labor discrimination cases. There's lots of environmental law or healthcare law, and it kind of allows you to go in a direction that you are interested in. And so I think this is a really good option for people that really like digging into the weeds of problems that have a tangible outcome, and maybe especially good for those of you that really like econ but maybe are less enthused about the math side, but you really like sort of the approach that you learn as far as looking at things analytically and being really careful about how you analyze a particular policy, let's say. Okay, the third option, which is obviously the one that I'm most familiar with, is an economics PhD. So I'm going to talk about that more in a little bit when I talk about my personal experience. And then another option, which I think might be a good option for a lot of people, is a master's in public policy. And these programs didn't really exist that much 10 years ago, kind of around the time that I was coming out of Colby, but recently they've become really good. And I've pointed out here some programs in particular that I think are very strong. Berkeley, Harvard, University of Chicago, University of Michigan, Duke, and NYU all have really good masters in public policy programs. And so if you're interested in working on public policy, these can give you a good entry into some of those jobs. And like options, you can, like in law, you can kind of specialize in different things, where you might be advocating for health policies or working on unemployment or things like that. Different think tanks have different agendas. But it gives you, if you like academic research, but maybe not the minutia of academic research, I think working in policy is a good option for you, because it kind of gets you closer to the ground of working with probably the questions that you care most about. Okay. So my advice for graduate school is don't go straight to graduate school. I think it's really valuable to spend a year or two or even three, you know, working for a year where you get different skills when you work, um, you know, out in the real world. Like you could become really good at coding, for example. Or I think the more valuable thing is that you get to kind of test the waters in a job before, you know, committing to it long term. You get to see, do you like research, or do you like, you know, consulting, or do you like policy work? And even if you think that you're dead set on going to graduate school, my conjecture is that the people that kind of make the most of their graduate school experience are the ones that have previous experience outside of school that can then bring those experiences to what they're doing in graduate school. And if you guys have specific questions about that, we can talk about that at the end. Okay, so briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience. So actually, I'll back up a second and talk a little bit about sort of my time at Colby for a second. So I decided pretty early on that I really liked econ. So basically, when I was taking the intermediate theory courses, so I think it's economics 223 and 224, if that's what they're still called. Like I really liked those classes, and I think it was during my sophomore year that I really solidified that I wanted to do a PhD because basically I just really liked thinking about those questions. And I took classes from a lot of people that are still at Colby, like Professor Wald Kirch, Donahue, Hubbard. I think that's, let's see, so I didn't take a class with Professor Gunter and Professor Lefebvre, but I interacted with them a lot, kind of on as an RA, and Professor Lefebvre was my thesis advisor. And so while at Colby, I was able to, you know, develop relationships with professors basically by working on the project that they were working on. So I would go to different professors, ask them if they had any research that they needed assistance with, and that led to different opportunities a couple different times with different people. So yeah, that's kind of my background. So at Colby, I knew that I really was interested in thinking about how individuals make decisions, and in particular, kind of like the psychological and social influences that affect people. And so, like, my thesis was about how the people in your classes affect how you do in those classes. And I actually got some really cool data from Colby, from the Colby registrar, of like everybody at Colby, how, not with names, of course, but de-identified data of every class they were taking, who was in that class, and basically quantifying, you know, if you're kind of in the middle of the distribution as far as like how well you would be expected to do in a class, and you're in a class with just a bunch of people that are really, really smart, like how does that affect you? And basically the idea is like, you know, it's probably good to not be like always feeling like you're behind, is basically the idea. So it was definitely a good experience to get some hands on data that you could work with, and it was cool that Colby was willing to let me use that data. So like I said previously, I worked at the Fed, and so the first opportunity for that was between my junior and senior year. And basically I decided that I applied to those jobs because I knew that I wanted to get an econ PhD, and just the more research experience that you have helps with that. So at the Boston Fed, I worked with President Rosengren, who's a Colby alumni and trustee. You might recognize the name, and that frankly definitely helped me get the job. And so I worked on a bunch of different topics related to some research related to mutual funds, and then Another really cool part of the job was to help write and edit speeches that he was giving. So Fed presidents go out to different public forums and sort of give their views on the state of the economy. And part of my job was to, make the graphs that were associated with the presentation that he was giving, and make sure that the statistics that he was citing were correct. So that involved pulling data from different sources and so forth. At the San Francisco Fed, where I worked after graduating, I worked kind of in a weird group where my bosses were bank regulators, but I didn't have the clearance to work on that work. So I basically only worked on their research, their academic research. And so that was a good experience from the perspective of learning what it felt like to do research on a full-time basis. And then also I became a much better coder in that time. It wasn't necessarily the best match as far as like what I was interested in working on, because I have always been interested in like the decisions that individuals make, whereas this was more working with like macro data basically, but still definitely very valuable as far as understanding really what it feels like to do research on a full-time basis. Okay, so I think a question that comes up for a lot of people is, does it make sense for me to get an econ PhD? And my answer to that is, it makes sense if you really, 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 really love economics and economic research. And so like the way that I describe this to people is that for me, like economics is beautiful, which is weird to say, but I really like thinking about how theories of the ways people behave sort of should be in theory, and then mapping that to data and showing that it plays out in data. And basically an econ PhD makes sense if you really like taking a deep dive into questions. Like you'll be working on projects for years is basically one way to put it. And you need to be really self-motivated and willing to work hard. As far as getting into a PhD program, it's pretty competitive. And so that's something that you need to be aware of if you're at all thinking about it. And basically everybody that's applying is going to have a good transcript with a lot of high grades and good test scores. So it's there's a lot of people that want very few spots, and so you just need to kind of be aware of that and really set yourself apart if you're interested in this path. So as far as like what classes it's important to do well in for getting into an econ PhD program, I think the most important are the ones that I've listed here. So the micro and macro theory classes, econometrics, math econ, and game theory as far as econ courses go. As far as like the field courses go, it doesn't matter a whole lot which ones you take, but basically you should take some, and you should take the ones that you're interested in, and that can really help you build relationships with professors, which might lead to research experiences down the line. The other thing that's important as far as getting into a econ PhD program is that econ PhDs, you use a lot of math, and so you need to have a pretty strong math background. And in particular, they're probably looking for these courses here, including linear algebra, a lot of statistics classes, and then real analysis. Research experience is really important. Like I said before, in doing an honors thesis shows that you're interested in research and can be self-directed. Also, having RA experience helps a lot. And I think RA experience really helps when it comes to getting letters of recommendation. And I've put an asterisk here around kind of the things where I think being at Colby can really help you, which is basically you're going to have an advantage of having close contact with your professors. So I would go out of your way to make sure that you're utilizing that close contact and getting to know your professors so that you can build a relationship and then they can down the line write a strong letter of recommendation for you. Okay. So because we're a little bit short on time, I think I'm going to go a little bit quickly through some of these later slides. But basically, like I said before, I think having some experience between Colby and grad school is important. And if you're thinking about kind of a research trajectory, there's lots of different options. Like to get an RA job, there's lots of government agencies, or another good option is working full-time for a professor at some university. And actually a way to find a lot of those jobs is on Twitter. If you follow a lot of economists, you can usually find those jobs. And then there's also other, jobs that will give you good experience as well, like working at a think tank or in economic consulting, for example. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of being a behavioral economist and give you a little bit of a sense of kind of academic research that you do in an econ PhD. So basically what behavioral economists do is to inject some psychology into economics. And here I've got this graphic, which I like to explain it with, which is where we're still doing all the economics. We're just increasing the psychology is basically the way to think about it. And so like, for example, my project that I've spent the most time on in graduate school has to do with these famous ideas from psychology, which are basically reference dependence and loss aversion. So reference dependence is the idea that people care about how outcomes compare relative to some reference point. And then more specifically, they tend to be more sensitive to what they perceive or what's framed as a loss than what's perceived as a gain relative to some reference point. And so you can think of that as a change in the marginal utility associated with some outcome relative to the reference point that you have for that outcome. And so some of you might be familiar with like the famous New York City taxi driver studies where there's evidence there that people basically have taxi drivers have a daily income target, and that leads them to sort of stop working after they've hit that target. Basically what I've done in my research is to try to use these ideas to show that loss aversion and reference dependence are really important in another setting, and moreover can be measured really precisely in a different setting. So what's really hard about using these ideas from psychology is that it's hard to know what people use as reference points. And so basically what I did is what I've done in my research is to point to a economic decision that a lot of people make where I would argue that the reference point is pretty clear. And so that is on property taxes. So if you own a house, basically you pay taxes on it every year. And what happens is that every year you get basically a bill in the mail, and it says what your taxes are this year, or what's the value of your house this year, and is going to translate into some tax dollars. And then it'll also say what was it last year. And so the fact that it says on this bill what was your assessment last year gives homeowners a really precise reference point to compare their taxes this year to. And the idea is basically that people are going to try to, so in the US, you can try to argue that your property taxes are too high and that your house is misvalued. And so basically what I'm saying in this research is that even though people might be overvalued, no matter sort of what the change was since last year. So even though the value of your house might have gone down since last year, you might still be overvalued. Basically, people only care if their taxes have gone up since last year. So you can see that in the data by looking at when people try to appeal the assessment on their taxes, the probability function of appealing looks something like this, where basically people are only appealing their property tax bills when they increase. So you can see that it's all normalized to the level at which people appeal given no change in value, which is that 0 in the middle. But you can see that once the taxes increase, all of a sudden people are much more likely to try to get their taxes lower. And the point being that you could still be overvalued even if your house value has gone down since last year. So there's the psychological phenomenon is that there's this kink around 0. And you can also see this in the values that people argue for. You can, what I'm showing here is that people say that their opinion of their home value is that it shouldn't have changed. And in fact, after sort of these tussles over value have occurred, you can see that a lot of people get back to last year's value, which is 0% change since the previous year. Okay, so that was a really quick version of some of my research. Oh yeah, there's one more thing. So another piece of this research is to sort of basically put a dollar value on how much does loss aversion matter to people. And I'll just point to the bottom right figure here. This is homeowners who own a property in the top quartile of value. So these are people that own a home that's, I think, above about $500,000. And so what this psychological phenomenon is doing is basically it's saying it's getting people really upset when their taxes increase, and it's causing them to argue for their taxes to go down. So how much is that worth? Basically, I'm saying that it depends on how much your taxes have gone up. That's what the horizontal axis is here. It's going from no change since last year to up to 10%. Among people that had a 10% increase, basically this psychological phenomenon is affecting them by about $115 per year, all the way to the right of that graph. So the point being that there's a real sort of tangible way in which this psychological bias affects the economic decisions that people make. And when I was at Colby, I got really interested in applied theory, particularly when I took the math econ classes. And so since then, I've spent many years working on sort of behavioral ideas and a lot of work. And kind of the upshot of that is that, somebody in my field thinks that this is one of the best demonstrations of this psychological phenomenon in economics in a natural setting so far, which, it's always nice when other people think your work is valuable. So that's kind of what the arc of doing research is, right? It's coming up. So I skipped over a lot of the theory, but basically it's coming up with a theory, understanding what that predicts about what is going to happen with data, and then showing that does happen in data. Okay, so as far as some kind of closing advice things, elements here, and I think maybe we'll run 10 minutes over so that we can have some time for Q&A. Here's my advice is, if you're in your early years, I would just say explore different courses. You don't know what you're going to end up liking, and it's also important to have a good group of friends. So if you're in your freshman year, that's what I would focus on. In sophomore year, I would say it's pretty important to focus on your coursework. When you apply to internships for after your junior year, basically they're going to have the part of your transcript that they're going to pay the most attention to is your sophomore year and the beginning of your junior year. And given that you apply for a lot of those jobs during the fall of your junior year, basically they're looking at your sophomore year. So it's really important to invest some time in your sophomore year in your courses. After that, I think it's important to just look for as many opportunities as you can find, network with people, search LinkedIn to find things that sound like a good match, and then also build skills that make you attractive to companies. Okay, so as far as some more specific advice is, I think no matter what fields you're going into, I think taking math and statistics classes are really valuable. And I would specifically encourage everybody to take Math 381, which is the calculus-based probability class, and uh, basically the class that comes after that, which is statistical inference with calculus. And the reason that I say this is I think that, so many people, they kind of understand probability and statistics, but they don't really understand it. And taking those classes makes statistics and econometrics and machine learning makes so much more sense. And like really understanding randomness, um, first of all, just teaches you a lot about the world, and thinking about models of randomness teaches you a lot about the world. So I would recommend everybody to take that. I also noticed that there's this class, statistical learning in data science, where basically it sounds like an introduction to machine learning. It sounds like a really cool class. I wish it was there when I was a student. It wasn't. And you might want to consider taking a CS class, or perhaps alternatively just learning how to code on your own. There's a lot of good free resources online. And personally, I think I would have found taking a coding class or a CS class kind of boring. Don't tell that to the CS people, but so I find it useful to learn those skills while working on a project. But the point is, knowing how to code, even if it's just at kind of like an intermediate level, really makes you valuable to a lot of different potential job opportunities. Okay, other things, definitely build up relationships with your professors. I talked about that before. And take classes outside of economics. Some of the advantage of being at a place like Colby is that you can, explore different things, and you don't need to be so one track. Some of the classes that I sort of remember most fondly, or feel like I learned a lot in, were about Latin American history, which is something that I don't do anything with on sort of like a work basis, but I feel like you learn a lot about populism, which is a theme in the world right now, and it still gives you some good perspectives. Okay, a couple other things to keep in mind, which is this is an idea from behavioral economics, which is known as projection bias, which is we don't always predict how our preferences are going to change in the future. And I've got this cartoon here, which helps explain the difference between people at your stage of life and people at my stage of life. But basically, projection bias is the idea that people tend to understand that their preferences in the future are going to change, and they know kind of the direction that they're going to change, but they don't understand how much they're going to change. And so how do you kind of combat against that? I think the way to do that is to acquire skills that are going to help you on the path that you're on, but that are also flexible enough to still use when your plans change. And there's different ways to interpret that, but I think it's something that's useful to keep in mind. Okay, almost finished here. But the last point that I will make about kind of thinking about your career are, I'm a believer in the Dan Pink theory of being happy in your job. So there's this book called Drive. Some of you might have read it. But basically, the idea is that if you have 3 things, you'll be happy in your job. So the first is autonomy, basically having control over what you do, or at least some control. Mastery, which is basically you want to be working on something that challenges you, but is not so challenging that you can never make any progress. And then finally, finding something that you find purpose in really makes people much happier in their job. So as you're thinking about different options, you want to think about each of those things and how well the job meshes with autonomy, mastery, and purpose. No matter what you're doing, I think it's important to, identify people that are going to be on your team, as it were, and be mentors to you. And, the way to gain more time with those people is to find out how you can be useful to those people. So if there's a professor that you have that you want to be mentored by, go ask them if they have some data project that you can help out with, and that'll give you some face time and like some things to talk about with those people. Okay, so finally, I think that grit and risk taking are also important. Lots of people fail all the time, and in particular, people that are really successful fail all the time. And the fact that they have failed a bunch is what led them to be successful. Like speaking from my own experience, like I thought I wanted to go straight to graduate school after Colby. I applied to probably 20 different schools and I got into one, and I decided it wasn't really I wasn't really excited about going to that program. And so I probably did what I should have done all along, which was to go work for a bit and then apply again. And then the second time around, things worked out for me. And I think that, failing feels really hard to you in the moment, and it feels like everybody is watching when you fail in some sense, but in reality, that's not true. And like looking back, like you're never going to spend as much time thinking about the times that you fail. And even more so, other people really aren't going to spend that much time thinking about the times that you fail. So even though it feels like a lot in the moment when you fail, you get over it pretty quickly. And I think that's kind of sometimes psychologically hard to realize before the fact. And then, the last piece of advice is like, as far as risk taking goes, some people might look at decisions that you make and say like, that was a dumb idea. But if it's the right choice for you, then that's what you should do. And, the example that I use here is when I was applying to the jobs at the Fed, I had an interview where I knew I was one of the last 8 people to be interviewed. So I basically thought that I had a 1 in 8 chance at getting this job at the Fed. Internship. This was at the internship stage. And at the same time, I had a job offer to go work in an investment banking job, which had a really nice summer salary and probably also would have been a good experience. But at least I decided that wasn't the path for me. But the problem was I had to make a decision on that job before I was going to hear back about the Fed job. And so basically I had really good investment banking job on the table, or I could give that up and give myself a 1 in 8 shot at I'm the one that's going to get this job at the Fed that I really want. And obviously I decided to do that other one because it felt like, that's the risk I need to take at this moment. And I think being true to yourself in that way is important. Okay, so I went 20 minutes beyond what I thought I would, but hopefully that was somewhat useful, and would love to hear you guys' questions now and so forth.
Yeah, if this was in person, everybody would be giving you a round of applause. That was great. Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much. But yeah, it's open for questions now. It looks like we have some emoji, and some clapping. That's great. But yeah, guys, any questions at all whatsoever? He gave us a really holistic view of his career path and everything, and the opportunities that are out there. But please, any questions, go right ahead.
Yeah, great presentation, Peter. I just kind of have a question, just out of curiosity, that what's maybe your long-term goal after your graduation? Like what you might want to do like after graduation?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm interested in continuing to work on research. I like teaching, but I also like working on different projects. And part of the reality of going to specifically econ graduate school is you need to be open to different opportunities, because basically you apply to a bunch of different jobs, and in any particular year, only you get so specialized that only a few places are going to actually be requiring somebody with the specific skill set that you need to do. So it's a little bit hard to say ex ante what's going to happen, but you I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is that like I might do something for a while and I might change and do something else for a while. It's not always particularly clear. But I think that is something to appreciate about going the econ PhD route is like you don't, because you become so specialized, you might not have that much control as to like what job you go into, because like only a few companies or schools or whatever will be looking for like the very particular skill set that you have in any given moment.
Yeah, gotcha. Thank you.
So when you were at Colby, like, and you decided that you want to pursue a PhD at that time, did you know that behavioral economics is the one that you're gonna like pursue as a PhD career, or like you did some research and then you kind of experienced different things and then you decided that's what you want to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I did know to some extent, but the thing was, a couple things. So one, when I was at Colby, there was no behavioral econ class. You know, behavioral econ has slowly been growing, and now finally, like more and more places have a behavioral econ class. And so I was kind of learning on my own what was behavioral econ, and so I had some ideas, and I knew that those sorts of questions interested me, but I didn't really have a structured mindset of what behavioral econ actually entailed, certainly to the extent that I have today, or even what the sort of knowledge that I had after 1 year of grad school. But I think the way to answer the question is like I had a pretty good idea that that's what I wanted to work on, but I definitely solidified that interest once I was in graduate school.
Hi. I just want to follow up on the last question. So that do you have take any psychology class on Kobe, or if we want to let you go into economics, do you recommend any psychology class in general?
Okay, so I took intro psych during my freshman year and during my freshman fall, and you know, I barely remember that class. um, like I didn't become super academic until my sophomore year. Like once I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school, like to be honest, I didn't pay much attention to classes in my freshman year, and so it's really hard for me to evaluate like those classes. I think looking back, like it would have made sense for me to take a cognitive psychology class. I think that's kind of the area that's most applicable to certainly behavioral economics, but also kind of economics in general, because that's kind of the branch of psychology that deals with decision making and like risk perception and things like that. Potentially also social psychology would have been useful as well. But yeah, I think cog psychology is probably the one that I would recommend.
Thank you.
Oh, a follow-up question. So you mentioned that you decided that you want to do behavioral economics at the in the first year of your grad school. So you don't have to decide like before you go to the grad school. So like you don't have to
So
decide.
most people come in with a pretty good idea of what they want to do, and like that is the idea that I came in with. And then in grad school, basically the way that it works at most places is that you choose 2 fields of specialization. So for example, my fields of specialization were behavioral and then labor economics. Now, it turns out that in my work, I've ended up working on questions that are much closer to like public finance and public economics. But yeah, so you kind of choose 2 specializations, and then usually one of those is like more of a specialization than the other.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Any more questions?
Do
Speak
you have
now.
any regrets about your decisions at all, or wish you've done better in anything, or
As far as going to
yeah,
grad school is concerned, or
just like in general on your path to grad school and your time at Colby and where
okay,
you
so
are now?
specific to being at like regrets about Colby.
Yeah, and like your time here in application applicable to grad school. Yeah.
Um, well, I definitely wish I won more broomball championships. uh, let's see. As far as getting on the right path for going to graduate school, I mean, like I mentioned or alluded to before that I didn't take my freshman year super seriously, and I think that kind of led me to have to really catch up during the rest of my time. Like, so to have a competitive GPA to get into graduate school, I basically needed to um, ace all of my classes from sophomore year on. Like, so to give you like an idea of like during my freshman year, I think I had like a couple B's, a couple C's in different classes, and part of that was because I was taking a bunch of taking some classes that I had to take for requirement purposes, but weren't necessarily things that I was super interested in. Um, and so, I mean, looking back, obviously that made my path a lot harder because I didn't give myself a lot of wiggle room. But as far as taking specific classes, I don't think I would have done anything different as far as which classes I was taking. I might have tried to identify a post Colby RA job that was a little better aligned with my interests. So like I said, when I was working at the Fed, I was working on questions relating to international finance, which is really not what I am particularly interested in. Like I said before, I'm really interested in like looking at data about individuals. And so maybe that would have been a way that I could have sort of better set myself up for grad school in the sense that like I would have a slightly better idea of like what questions are interesting to people in the field.
Thank you so much. And I was just curious. I'm like interested in behavioral econ in regards to public policy and the implement, like how to implement it into public policy. Like, where would you go to like study this at Colby? Because it's very niche, I guess.
Well, I mean, so yeah, I agree that that's pretty niche. I mean, I would guess that Professor Giffin's class touches on some of that. Have you taken her class or no?
I'm a freshman, so I know nothing about anything or anyone.
Okay, got it. So,
yeah.
so Professor Giffen teaches a class in behavioral economics, and I don't specifically know what's on her syllabus per se, but I would imagine that a good chunk of the class is related to public policy, and so that would definitely be a good place to go. Also, more and more uh, behavioral has been integrated into public economics. So in a public economics class that you're taking, you might talk about different sort of behavioral strategies that people use to accomplish public policies.
In
Thank
addition
you
to
so
that,
much.
I'll also speak to the public policy side of it. I took public policy and economic development. It's a 200 level class. It focuses a little bit more on small towns, small business, but I think there could be some cool crossovers in terms of where you can really see that policy and those ideas being implemented. But yeah, just a recommendation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I've been assigned an art history faculty advisor, so like econ's like
Gotcha.
far away from me. Yeah.
Yeah. I totally understand, and like Peter said, get to know as many faculty in the department as possible. Go around and introduce yourself. And we're going to be having our meet and greet next week, next Thursday. It's going to be a great opportunity to meet some professors in the department, and kind of stick your toe in the water in different areas. But yeah, any more questions for Peter? Any last minute ideas, comments, concerns? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Peter. Really just a
No
great
problem.
job and just a really holistic overview of sort of how the different industries play into being an economics major, and all the different areas you can take it. Really just a great presentation. And thank you everybody for attending. We'll be in contact over the next few days about some more upcoming events. But if you have any more questions for Peter, or any more burning questions, feel free to reach out to me, and maybe we can get something set up. But other than that,
I'm
I
happy
think
to stay on this call. Also, if like anybody wants to sort of chat, in a smaller group for 15 minutes or something, I'll stay on.
great, awesome. Thank you so much. All right, well, thank you so much, everybody, and have a great weekend and study hard for those midterms. And good luck.
All right, good to talk to all of you.
We got some thank yous in the chat, it looks like. Awesome.
Cool. Anything? I see there's a couple people hanging around here. Do you guys have questions or?
Catherine, Ria, anybody, Chris?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I don't have. Oh, sorry. I don't have any other question. I just want to say that it's a great presentation that you had. Thanks for like showing up for our club and supporting our club.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thank you. It was a really good presentation.
Catherine, did you want to ask something or?
Sorry, like I've been two-manning something really fast. My brother is currently like a PhD statistical marketing student at Booth. So he was like telling me all about his